My name is Phyllis Wise, and I'm the president of the University of Washington for an interim period of time while the search committee searches for a permanent president. And it is really my honor to be able to introduce John Hennessy this afternoon. Dr. Hennessy is the president of Stanford University, and in a meteoric rise or fall, depending upon how you look at it, he was the dean of the College of Engineering for 3 years, the provost for 1 year, and then was anointed as the 10th president of Stanford University in the year 2000. So he's been president for 10 years. John is the model leader, both in academics. His scholarship is outstanding as a researcher and as an administrator. And we're really very fortunate to have him today talking on the topic of the future of our research universities, its challenges and opportunities, and we're really all anxiously awaiting to hear the answer.
Thank you, Phyllis. I think I've blabbed on. So when you say, well, he was dean for 3 years and provost for 1 year, and then he became president, it's just proof that I can't hold a job. And I hope this talk will prove to you that you can survive 10 years as a university president without losing your mind, but we'll see how you feel about it. So what I'm going to do is start by first saying a little about some good news, but then talk about what I think is a rapidly changing dynamic that could threaten, I think, what has been the crown jewel, and certainly the crown jewel in the education sector in the US, are higher education research universities. And what's happening, I'll certainly talk about research, what's happening in science and engineering education, our public institutions, which I think here we are in one of the great ones, and the threats to them. But then also thinking about what can we do differently? How can we reconceive our future, think differently about where we're going, what can we do? Let me just say that my last bullet point there, be bold. So this is not a time for complacency in higher education. This is a time to be thinking outside the box, to be experimenting with new models, and to think differently about the future of our institutions. There are parts of the world where universities were complacent, happy with the status quo. Those are not where the great universities of the world are anymore. So we need to think ambitiously about our universities and where they need to go. So the good news, American research universities are widely admired. People from all over the world, whether it's from the former Soviet Union or from Asia, come to America to learn how to build great research universities. The reputation's very high. If you look at some of these, and these are all the international, this is not the famous NRC rankings of universities that my good friend Ed Lazowska knows a lot about. It's the only research ranking where your department can report more faculty than you have, and the quality of your department goes down, which is a unique prospect. But these are 3 international rankings: the Shanghai Jiao Tong, the Times Higher Education, and ARW, which all give us 10 out of 10, 7 out of 10, 8 out of the top 10, and very high out of the top 50. So the record is great. We also have, by far, the best track record of moving innovations into industry broadly throughout American higher education, and that has worked well in terms of fueling the economy and making strong arguments for the importance of our universities, something I think that Europe has had a much harder time in doing. I think the innovative and entrepreneurial spirit remain vibrant. People are interested in working on important problems. They're focused on them. Students are energetic. They're committed to try and make a difference. And I think that spirit continues to serve us well. Competition among institutions has bred excellence. Here is an example of why competition works. Private institutions and public institutions at higher education compete against one another head to head for students, for faculty, and both sides get better because of that. And I think it's one of the real demonstrations that competition can actually cause both parties to rise. Merit-based federal research funding has worked really well to fund the best research fairly consistently. And we've got great competition, and that remains terrific. But changes are afoot. In the Rising Above the Gathering Storm report from the National Academy, which, by the way, the nickname for this report is RAGS. So if you want to just act like you're in the Go, you say, I read the RAGS report. It said, you know, so that's what it's called, RAGS. Rising Above the Gathering Storm in 2005, they pointed at a number of problems. Stagnating research support, emerging well-funded competition, and I'll show you some data on this. A lack of U.S. interest among students in science and engineering, particularly physical sciences and engineering. Graduate students increasingly international, and whether or not that poses a long-term challenge to us, and I'll show you some data on that. My ad is that we have the most scientifically, technologically driven period in the history of this country, we have a society that is largely ignorant of science and technology. And that is a fundamental problem. We often say, well, we don't have to worry about it because we're educating scientists and engineers. But we're not educating all there are decision makers out there that don't understand the role of science and technology, and it makes them inferior as decision makers. A brand new update is out, approaching Category 5, as in Category 5 storm. Little progress. Things are worse in some cases, and I'll show you some scary budget data. And my addition would be that public institutions, given what's happened in state finances, are under particular stress. So now some data. What I'm going to do is show you lots of bad news and then hopefully talk about some good news. And I'm an optimist, so I'll finish with an optimistic view of things. Trends in federal R&D as a percentage of GDP. The right metric here to use is the percentage of gross domestic product, because we would like the research funding by the country to grow as the gross domestic product grew. You notice it's been up and down, but the last few years we're on another downward slope here, and I think a general trend from numbers that it had back in the 1970s. This number was actually even a little higher if you extrapolate further back into the post-Sputnik era. It was up around 1.5 at its peak, but that number has gone slowly down. And of course, there's been trade-offs over time between how much it went in research and how much in development, but the overall fact that the line is dropping is somewhat worrisome. That simple curve masks another problem, which is most of the growth in funding has gone to the biomedical sciences. And you see this top line, the NIH biomedical research growth, very fast. This is in real dollars. Physical sciences, essentially almost flat. Engineering up slightly, but not very much, and very bumpy along the way. Other disciplines considerably lower. And computer science is down here with math. For some odd thing, the National Science Foundation still puts computer science with math rather than with engineering, but that's another problem to work on. Federal support of engineering research. You notice some big jumps along the way, but that the numbers have fallen over the last roughly decade to below inflationary growth. In general, if you look at these curves, what you see is that the growth is it basically doesn't compensate for inflation. So inflation's being taken out. So every year you're losing 2.5% or 3% to inflation. And that's a long-term worrisome problem. There's lots of little independent things that happen here. Obviously, NASA's challenges with getting its next generation mission is dramatically undermining the scientific mission of NASA and its ability to do its basic scientific work. And that's a long-term challenge for us. We may, not that I think we're going to Mars anytime soon, but we could spend a lot of dollars trying to figure out how to get to Mars and undermine a lot of things. And as far as I'm concerned, boy, those little rover robots on Mars worked pretty well, got a lot of kids excited about science, and I'm not sure they were any worse than sending a person to Mars, and they're a lot cheaper than sending people to Mars. Now, where are things changing? Well, here's one slide which shows you where things are changing. Where's the world's R&D spent? So here we are, North America. We had the largest slice back in 1996. It's dropped since then as a percentage of the world R&D, and of course what's growing is Asia and the Pacific. Numbers are still smaller than they are in the US, but growing quite quickly. And in fact, the slide I really like is this one, which combines 4 different measures of what's happening in science and technology. R&D expenditures, researchers, the number of researchers, high-tech exports down on the right, and articles published on the top right, all normalized to 1996. So now you see what the dynamic that's occurring, namely the US is down here, and China is here, China is up here, China is up there, and China is up on the top here, with Asia right below it. So that's the change that's occurring. The numbers, if you boil them down, the number of articles published, the amount of R&D expenditures are still smaller than they are in the US. But the delta is really what's concerning, and that shift. And the high-tech sector, in the end, the science and technology investment, is the seed corn for the next generation of economic growth for the country. So this is something to think and worry about. It's also happening with respect to degrees. If you look back in 1975, we were sort of tied with Finland for producing the ratio of science and engineering degrees to population. So this is a ratio. How many people have their first degree in science and engineering as a percentage of the population, right? 1975, we're tied with Finland and just behind Japan. In 2000, we're somewhere down between Belgium and Mexico in terms of the number of people who are getting, percentage of the population who are getting their degrees. Everybody went to economics, headed to Wall Street, and became investment bankers. That didn't work out so well. So now we're in a reboot to try to think about what we might do differently in here. But this is a really serious concern in terms of the trajectories that are occurring here. And of course, that plays out as you then go look at what happens at graduate school, the percentage of visa holders among new PhDs. In engineering, we're now up to 50%, just over 50%. And some institutions are considerably higher than that in terms of that. Rising numbers in the physical sciences. Biological sciences somewhat smaller, partly because of funding mechanisms around training grants and other things. But we see the numbers steadily going up there. And if you look at what happens as a result, the percentage of the individuals who are born outside the US who take on science and engineering jobs, and you see the numbers going up from 1990 down here to 2005. So at the PhD level, essentially over 40% of the individuals who get a PhD and enter the workforce are born outside the US. Our problem here is, can we depend on this? It has been an enormous opportunity for the US to bring all this talent from around the world to come here, do their higher education, settle, make a contribution to our society. It has been great. We've gotten all this brain and talent, and the diversity you see in our high-tech firms because of that is remarkable. But the real question is, will this continue? What will happen as those home institutions get better? What will happen if we don't get something in terms of visa reform, in terms of keeping these individuals once we've made an investment? And if you think how much is invested in a PhD student graduating from a PhD program at University of Washington. $500,000? Quite conceivably. So that's a gigantic investment we've made. And if we say to that person, sorry, you can't stay in this country and make a contribution here, then we've really lost on that investment. The public interest in science-related issues remains high. This is kind of surprising, except for space exploration. They've had enough of it. It's kind of plummeting here. You know, how many people have watched a shuttle launch in the last 5 years? If it happens to be on the news when I'm walking by, and I'll tell you, when we went to the moon, we were all glued to that TV set. It's just, you know, once you've gone in orbit a lot of times on the same shuttle and you go up to it doesn't capture public interest anymore. But in other areas, it's quite high. Medical discovery is quite high. Use of inventions and new technologies remains quite high. So there's a lot of interest. But look what's happening on the press coverage side. Virtually every newspaper has gotten rid of almost all their scientific reporters. The New York Times has a little tiny Science Times that came out today remaining, but largely that expertise is gone. So we don't have reporters that really have enough grounding in science and technology and spend enough time on it that they can do a good job of reporting. One of the outcomes of that is that the reporters will distinctly not take any positions with respect to global warming, and they'll make the people who say, well, global warming's a fake, sound as important as the people who, the much larger scientific community that agrees with the results around what's happening to our climate. But this is a real problem. Without that expertise and without an adequate background in science and technology, how do you figure out what's going on in the world? This is an increasing problem, and it's going to affect our policy in lots of ways, whether it's how we define curriculum for young people, how we think about issues like climate change, how we think about issues about risk and thinking about the future of power in this country and how we're going to get energy. These are all issues that involve some understanding of science. Stem cells, we have the same thing. I still remember when we were getting ready to build a new stem cell laboratory, one of my good friends, a Nobel Prize winner in the medical school, was talking to press, and he said, well, you know, we have these stem cells, these human embryos, and we're going to clone stem cells from it. And it came out in the press that Stanford was going to clone human babies and start making human babies. So I explained to my colleague that I understood what the word clone meant, but I wish he wouldn't use that word when he was talking about replicating a cell and would find an alternative definition. But the problem, of course, was the reporter didn't understand the fundamental difference. And as a result, a whole bunch of controversy came out. But that's okay. We opened the building last week, and it all worked out in the end. Scientific literacy is a global problem, not just a US problem. Things are not that great in Europe either. You look at some of these numbers. Half the population in the US believes that antibiotics kill viruses as well as bacteria. No wonder we have a problem with overuse of antibiotics, right? Luckily, half the people know that electrons are smaller than atoms, but the other half don't. This is the one that I find astonishing. So if you look at this, 70% of the people, 30% of the people in the US think that the sun goes around the earth. So we've really got some things going on here that are a little bizarre. So that's a real problem. If you don't know which is going around which, it's very hard to deal with the bigger pictures in science. These are all grammar school kinds of levels of knowledge, in my view. So the fact that we see this kind of difficulty shows how problematic it is. And I'll come back to some of these points when I start talking about what we need to think about in terms of solutions. I'm sure you see lots of plots like this, what's happening to the public research universities. Take a high research institution like University of Washington, and that number has steadily dropped over time in terms of real dollars. That may actually be more than you get per FTE, but, and it's a nationwide average, but it shows what's really happening, and even at the institutions that are research intensive but not very high research, the same kind of thing is happening. And the result is that net tuition as a percentage of the revenue has to climb steeply. And I think you've now seen a situation where net tuition as a percentage of revenue in the public research institutions probably exceeds net tuition as a percentage of revenue in the private institutions, despite the fact that our tuition is a lot higher than your tuition. And here is the hidden culprit. It's our inability to tame healthcare costs, entitlement, Medicare-related costs, and you just look at what's happened with Medicaid spending and what's happening to the states. And that is, you take that amount of money and you just draw it out of the entire system, and that makes the entire situation difficult. But it's not just a Medicaid state problem. It's a problem with our global budget. So this is a projection of US expenditures. This yellow line is basically tax revenue as a percentage of GDP. So one of the things you can look at in the country is tax revenue as a percentage of GDP is remarkably constant over time. It doesn't vary that much. And I think the reason's pretty simple. You start taking a much larger fraction of GDP, you destroy economic growth in the country. So as a percentage of GDP, this number's pretty flat across there. There's a little blip in here, but reasonably flat going forward. Look what happens when you get out here between 2040 and 2050. Interest on the debt, plus Medicaid, plus Medicare, plus Social Security are 100% of the tax revenue. 100%. And by the way, that doesn't include any spending on national defense. Federal R&D is 15% of that discretionary budget. All the research spending is a little tiny sliver of what's left over the discretionary budget. So the growth from year to year in Medicare spending, Part B, that was put in place by President Bush, is roughly equal to all the research spending of the federal government. So every year we're chalking up a number that's equal to everything that goes into our research universities. So this is a nightmare scenario which, unfortunately, we're not very good at addressing or grappling with, but we have to grapple with this problem. So what can universities do? Clearly, many of these challenges will require us to get policy changes at the federal and state level. I think the funding issues are most acute for the research universities. We've got to get back on a model that says R&D expenditures in the country will track GDP, and that means taming entitlement growth. And we've got to deal with this issue. We've avoided it. We haven't dealt with it. Unfortunately, for better or worse, the health care reforms didn't reform the key problem, which is taming the growth and the spending. We've got to urge Congress to make visa reform a priority. I'm in the Tom Friedman Green Card Club, so we stamped the visa and put it right on the diploma, staple it to the diploma, and give it out there. It's a brilliant thing for us to do. If the only people in Congress who voted lived on the East Coast or the West Coast, we could pass this. Unfortunately, there are all those states in the middle, and we have to worry about those states. So that's a key issue for us. We really have to work on this and work on visa reform. But we also need to think about things we can do inside the university. So what can universities do? Try to stamp out earmarking. Earmarking is a really bad thing. It is the enemy of the best research universities at the cost of other things. And what I remind everybody is that adjacent to the state of Washington are a few states that don't have research universities of the caliber of this one, but they have just as many senators as you have. So as we head down that earmarking curve, it is the great universities who will lose out in that process. And it's up to the university. Everybody always says, well, it was the congressman's idea. You know where the congressman got the idea? From the lobbyists that you hired that went in and told him. So this is really a key issue we need to work on. I'm going to say some more about educating leaders, innovators, and teachers. It's something we have to work on. Engaging more of our citizens. I want to say a little bit about efficiency because we have to think about how we do our jobs better, particularly on the research side. And then I'm going to finish by talking about some upbeat, interesting things I think we can do to really enforce the importance of universities. So educate leaders, innovators, and teachers. A liberal education model that we have inside our research universities does produce great leaders. It produces people who are designed and who are educated to be lifelong learners. Most of the jobs that the undergraduates of today have will not be the jobs they have 20 years from now. They may be in a different career. We used to talk about having 2 or 3 jobs during a lifetime. Now you have to think about having multiple careers during a lifetime. And we have to educate people. People are going to be working longer. They're going to be working longer because there's no way we can afford to support them if they don't work longer. So we've got to figure out how we educate them so that they're lifelong learners, so that they can become leaders. We've got to do a better job of educating students for science and technology understanding broadly, not just getting more students in science and technology, but broadly educating students. This is a very hard problem to solve. I think it would probably be reasonable to say that attempts to do a better job on scientific literacy have not been successful, and we need to rethink it. Nourish the entrepreneurial spirit and technology transfer. Research and research innovations not only create new companies, they create whole new industries. And that's what universities do. It's not just that individual company that comes out of the university, but a company that helps develop a new industry. Look at the internet. It's not just one company. It's a whole industry that's built around the internet. Hardware, software companies. And that's the kind of things that universities do. If you look at many of the startups and innovations that come out of the existing industry, they're incremental improvements on the next step. What universities can do is create something that's really new out of whole cloth. And that's where we really should be focused. We need to address conflict of interest, but there's a real danger that the impassioned pleas about conflict of interest, which would argue that we have to keep what goes on in the university far away from what goes on in industry, will only make it more difficult to take advantage of our research endeavors and our discoveries. We've got to acknowledge that there's an issue here. We've got to work on it, particularly around the biomedical sector. But if we get in a mode where we say, universities stay on that side of the room, industry stay on that side of the room, please don't mix in the middle, it will really hurt us in the long term. And some people believe that you can have that separation and then still have this movement of technology from the university to industry. I'll point out that if you look through the dozens of companies that have spun out of Stanford, none of them spun out by handing a research publication from a researcher in the university to a group of people in industry. They all spun out because people moved and people took ideas with them and insights with them. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. We've got to do something about the quality of teaching in K-12, and we've got to do something particularly about science and math teaching. So I want to talk a little bit about this problem just to show you some data so you see how important it is. So how are U.S. students doing internationally? This is an international math test, the TIMSS math test, taken by 15-year-olds. I put up the math one, but I could put up the science one. It doesn't make a big difference. The results are not great. Here's Finland, South Korea, Netherlands, Japan, 15 other OECD countries, and there we are after those 15. So we're about 20th in the world, 25th in the world, below Liechtenstein, below Macau. I thought Macau, all they knew was gambling, and we're below them. So we're in the bottom third among OECD countries and the bottom half in science. Not a good place to be when we need to get more students into these fields. Fundamentally, the problem is teachers, teachers, teachers. Many teachers in science and math are underqualified. They have neither a major nor a minor in the subject they're teaching. If you look at grades K through 8, these are students that are taught by teachers with a major certification. So grades 5 through 8, in my view, a very formative time for introducing science and introducing mathematics. Only 31% of the teachers that teach math actually have a major or minor in a math-related subject. And in the physical science, only 7 of them that teach physical science have a degree in that. Even when you get to high school, the numbers are not great. Only a third of the physics teachers actually have a degree in physics. We do better in the biosciences, not so well in chemistry, not so well in physical sciences here. This is a real issue. How do you inspire young people about science and mathematics if you don't have people who are themselves inspired about science and mathematics? And by the way, when you go to underprivileged schools in poorer neighborhoods, this situation is even worse. So they have even less selection in terms of their ability to recruit teachers. We also need to do a better job of engaging all our students and getting all the interested students. I think this just shows you how the makeup of our country is changing over time. Somewhere between 2040 and 2050, we become a majority-minority population as a country. This has already happened in many of our institutions in our undergraduate population. The challenge is to ensure that it continues across all different disciplines. So this just shows you what's currently happening. These are underrepresented minorities already. So Asian Americans are pulled out. K-12 enrollment, 38.8%. College population of underrepresented minorities drops to 33, undergraduate enrollment to 26. Look at the big drop here, though, from 26% of the undergraduates to only 17.7% of the undergraduates in science and engineering, bachelor's degrees. Similar numbers in graduate enrollment. So many of the people, this number drops from here to here, but then graduate enrollment, again, a smaller fraction in science and engineering master's degrees, and when you look at doctorates, we're down at the 5% number. That number has been there for a long, long time and hasn't budged much. And if you look at one of the challenges that happens, so science and engineering majors always have a larger dropout rate than other majors. And we all convince ourselves it's just because science and engineering is tough. And, but the real question is, what can we do about that? Part of it is preparation in high school, no doubt, and we can improve high school preparation and the preparation of students coming in. But really, can't we do more to ensure that people who have an interest in this can succeed in it? And of course, one of the things you see is that the dropout rates are disproportionate across different groups. So a larger dropout rate for Latinos, blacks, and Native Americans compared to either Asian Americans, who actually had the lowest dropout rate given an interest in science and technology, compared to even Caucasians, whites. And we're not doing so well on women either. One of my great disappointments, many years ago, I thought computer science was going to be the engineering technology that broke through with women, and that we could get many more women enrolled in computer science. And while we've had some growth, it hasn't been the spectacular story that we all thought. We all thought it was the approachable engineering discipline and everything would work out great. And it didn't. So this is a challenging issue. But what this chart shows that I think is really interesting is you look at the growth. So we're doing better with women here than we did. But look at this. This is how we're doing with women who come from outside the US. So that's the big growth. And you look at the numbers, I mean, what you're seeing from China or from India, we're seeing many more women come into technical disciplines than we're seeing from our own US students. So we should ask ourselves, why is that? What are we doing? How come we're not setting the right standards for people and thinking about how we inspire people to go into these fields? Now, two areas, I'm going to touch on the area of PhD education because this is a place where we need to look at ourselves a lot more closely. And this just shows you what national completion rates are like in various subdisciplines: humanities, math and physical science, social sciences, life sciences, engineering. So notice that our 10-year completion rate in the humanities varies from 49% in the humanities down to 64% in engineering. If you think about the yearly investment in PhD students, and we realize that the completion rate cannot be 100%. I don't think anybody would ever expect it to be 100%. But these completion rates probably indicate that we're making a lot of investment in people, and they're investing a lot of their time because they could be out working, making a contribution to society. These are smart people if they get into PhD programs. The fact that they're entering in the PhD programs and not completing often after a long period of time, we need to hold ourselves accountable for that and think about how we improve that system. Of course, time to PhD is also a problem. This was documented back in 1992 by a book that Bill Bowen worked on that talked about the dramatic growth in time to PhD that occurred. Here we're slightly over 4 years in 1978, and we peaked just as Bowen published his book right in this region, up here at somewhat over, this is age, so we're over 30, and we're up around registered time to degree over 6 years, total time to degree over 10 years at that time. So this red line is total time. This is how much time they were registered as a full-time student, right? And this is age here. So that number just went up and up. It's gone down a little bit. But the problem is, if you think about this, okay, so people are now 33 when they get their PhD. And by the way, if they're in the biomedical sciences, which tends to produce a shorter time to degree, they're just ready to enter the postdoc holding pen, which you now enter for a period of 2 to 4 years before you get a job. I think what's most difficult about this problem is that increasingly we're not sending PhDs to academic jobs. It's not like they're building up their resume, they're getting lots of publications so that when they get in that academic job, they're so impressive and doing such a great job that they get early tenure and they really move through the system quickly. No, the vast majority of these PhDs are going out into jobs in industry, government, other nonprofits. I don't think you need to spend that long earning a degree if you're not being prepared for an academic job. And we let some of these things take over the system. So postdocs were originally started as a way to prepare people between their PhD and their academic career. Get their publications done, get all ready. But now, if you're in the biotech industry, you'll often hire only from postdoc pools. So we've set up a culture now that people now have to go do a postdoc and be held in this pre-professional status before they move on. This is a real problem, and if we, which I think is inevitable, since the academy is not growing quickly, more and more PhD students are going to go out into industry, into government, into nonprofits. We have to figure out how to reduce time to degree, because otherwise they're simply not going to enter the PhD programs, and we're going to have fewer students. So let me talk about the positive side of what I see as this opportunity, and then I'll talk about a few examples. So research, I think increasingly, if you ask where can the country and the world find the solutions to the really big challenges we face, energy and alternative environmentally friendly sources for energy, good governance and equitable economic growth in developing parts of the world, issues of how we're going to continue the semiconductor revolution. What are we going to do after the end of silicon? Where is that new creation that allows us to build this incredible, go forward with this incredible information technology revolution going to come from? What are we going to do about privacy and security in computer science? We've now gotten all these people into the internet. And now we have to tell them something very bad, namely all that data they gave us and all the information they gave us, we really can't keep it private or very secure. We were just pretending that we could. And now we've broken our bargain with you, which is that you thought all that information you had was secure. And this is a fundamentally difficult problem in computer science, because getting privacy and security while still having systems that are easy to use is very hard. I'm really excited about what's happening in machine learning with autonomous robots and vehicles. I think Ed Lazowski and I had a bet many years ago that when we were on the Microsoft Technical Advisory Board about a bet of set of ambitious things that would happen. And one was car that drove itself. So car that drove itself was supposed to be, what was it, 2000, Ed, probably about. And we won the bet easily. I mean, we didn't get close to car that drove itself. But Google has them. We're going to get cars that drive better than senior citizens, teenagers, people like me that get old and don't see so well at night anymore, and of course, people who had one drink too many and shouldn't be driving. We can build cars that will drive better than them. We can also build cars that will be better drivers than the average human driver on a highway, which will increase our highway capacity, reduce accidents, and as everybody knows, accidents are a giant cause of death for young people. So this technology is within reach. We can actually get there. I think that obviously the biomedical sciences, I tell my colleagues, they sometimes say, well, why are you doing so many things in the biosector? I said, well, you know what? This century is biology's turn. Chemistry had their turn, physics has their turn, now biology has their turn, and they really are going to change the world. And whether it's stem cells, genetic medicine, there's just so much happening, and it's really just in its infancy. It's just at the beginning. But I want to end with 3 examples of what I think are the kinds of collaborative, interdisciplinary research and teaching that we ought to be doing more of. So I'm really high on the neurosciences now because we're not even yet at the equivalent of the double helix discovery in the neurosciences. We really don't understand how the human brain works in the fundamental way that the double helix discovery gave us about how genetics works. It's just in its infancy. It is inherently multidisciplinary, all the way from the medical side, from people in clinical departments that do everything from neurosurgery to psychiatry, all the way over to people in psychology, to business schools. Business schools are incredibly interested now in how people make decisions and the cognitive processes that go on. This is just a little example of how to control a mouse with light by fusing together genetics and using recombinant DNA to alter the behavior of neurons in the brain so that they act under the influence of light. Using, by the way, a piece of DNA that comes out of a primitive one-cell algae that lives in salt ponds and uses the presence of light to turn itself so that it can get the maximum exposure so that it can do photosynthesis. This is just at the beginning, and we're going to have to build whole new technologies because we've gone about as far as we can go with monkeys. And as my colleagues in the medical school say, you know, we can put probes in monkeys' brains, we can teach them certain things and see if they repeat it, but when we ask them a question, they don't answer. And so we're kind of at the end of that, and we've got to move our technology now to a way in which we can begin to understand how the human brain works and how decisions are made. So I think this is a great area with great opportunities. And of course, lots of diseases. The longer we live, the more diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's become the thing we face as we get older. So good opportunities. Thinking differently about the ecosystem in which we live. How do we begin to think about the value that this planet gives us every single day and put real values on it so we can make complex, intelligent decisions about what we do in our ecosystem that maximize the ability of the Earth to provide sustainable geoservices for us for a long time. This is a big area, especially around water systems, and we've got a group of people, Natural Capital Project, working with universities, NGOs, and government to re-look at the value on natural resources. So a very simple example. Much of the watershed area in developing countries is owned by poor indigenous populations. But that watershed area is what enables São Paulo to have enough drinking water to have a city of 15 million people, right? New York City, incredible study done in New York City where it was demonstrated that it was more cost-effective for the city of New York to buy up watershed in the Catskills than it was to build a water filtration plant. And think about the good that happens. Now you buy and preserve this open space as opposed to let people build on it, and we've got a natural filtration system that's more efficient and more cost-effective than building an artificial filtration system. That's the kind of thinking that we need. I think increasingly our universities are also going to have to think about what we can do for the 50%, the 70% of the people in the world who haven't had the benefits that we've had in this country or other parts of the developing world. How can we think about using technology to make their lives better? So we started a few years ago a class called Entrepreneurial Design for Extreme Affordability. Design products that can be bought by people in the developing world that will make their lives better. One of the ones you probably heard about is a lot of work that's gone on improved stoves so that people use less wood, because if you look at wood cost, it's a major fuel is a major part of the budget of many people in the developing world. But we've done low-cost solar lanterns so that people in rural areas without electricity can have solar lanterns. We've done better manual irrigation pumps so people who do manual irrigation, so there are people out there in a lot of parts of the world who water their fields by basically manually pumping, usually pedal pumps. They usually step on them, and treadle pumps. Improve the efficiency. But the one I want to talk about is a great project that we did start a few years ago. A group of students went to Nepal, very hard to get to Tibet, went to Nepal and started a project looking at infant mortality. So it turns out in much of the developing world, the leading cause of early infant death, sort of in the first week, is hypothermia, because babies are born under birth weight, and if you're under birth weight, keeping your body temperature up turns out to be a major problem. So they set about they looked at Western-style incubators, $25,000 for what we would sell to a hospital. Even if you go to parts of the developing world, you go to India or China, they have the sort of jury-rigged light bulb things that aren't very good in terms of temperature consistency, but they still cost $2,000. So obviously, you're in a rural village, no electricity, this is not a good solution. So they set about trying to find a solution, actually collaborated with some students at MIT, and decided to build a baby incubator out of a baby mummy sleeping bag. So idea's very clever. You build a little tiny sleeping bag that keeps the baby in. Then they used some technology invented by a group of students at MIT, where you take a wax substance that melts by dropping it in a pot of boiling water. You then stick this in the back where it can keep the baby warm. Because it's melted, it has phase change. It keeps the baby's temperature steady for about 4 hours. And then if you need to, you pull it out and you drop it in another pot of water. And even if you have to move 8 hours by bus and walking in order to get to a hospital or a medical clinic so your baby can be seen, you're portable. You can move your baby along. So they designed this product. Their target was $250. They found a $25 solution, a solution that a little village with 200 people in could afford to buy as their village baby warmer for the next mother that had a premature infant. So this was a group of business school and engineering school students. Then last year they headed to India to set up a company, a nonprofit, to get this manufactured. And last spring they helped save their first baby. That's the kind of thing that research universities can do. We can change the world and make it a better place for everybody. That's why we should be optimistic. We have incredible students, and if we can maintain the vibrancy and the excitement and this willingness to try whole new approaches to problems, we can continue to be a beacon around the world. Thank you all for your attention.
Done about introductory courses in the sciences and engineering at Stanford. It seems to me that I remember something you said to me 8 years ago after you've been president for a couple of years, and that is that Stanford gives a great technical education to the 15% of the students who come there wanting it, but the other 85% in some sense leave as technophobic as they arrived. And I think a lot of that has to do with the nature of our intro courses. In some sense, in the humanities, you take an introductory course and you're exposed to the mode of thought, whereas our introductory courses are the first course in physics or the first course in computer science. And I wonder how you've dealt with that.
So we do teach a first course in computer science that's intended for people who are not going to be majors. It gives them enough background that they could take a second course, but not enough that they can proceed on a lot further than that. After enrollments fell after the .com turned into .bomb, but they're back up now, and so we probably back up around 75% of our students taking at least one computer science course, which I think is great because it's a technology that affects so many of us and it's a transferable skill. The other thing we did was to try an experiment using a freshman seminar program to get over this problem of, the first thing you come into an engineering course or an introductory physics course, the first thing happens, lots of equations go on the board. And you immediately say, well, I did that in high school, I don't want to do it again. Instead, we teach courses that really try to intrigue students about things. So one of my colleagues in Aero Astro teaches a course called Why Things Fall Down. So why do planes fly? Why do some other planes not fly? How does this entire mechanism work? We have a course on design of sports equipment that talks about introductory physics. Why do golf balls have dimples? Well, it turns out this is a very complicated physics problem. Boundary layers and turbulence and all kinds of great things. But you can teach some basics about it. Why do baseballs have stitches? There are lots of opportunities to bring some of this stuff to the public. My colleagues have taught a course on security and voting, which now with electronic voting systems has become a very hot topic. So I think we have to do some more to make the material approachable. And particularly for engineers, we've got to do a better job of teaching them that engineering is about interdisciplinary problem solving in teams. It's not about sitting in cubicles with a bag over your head writing code. It actually is teamwork. It's completely different than people think. It's solving problems. The challenge in many of these disciplines is, in order to be successful, you do have to master some skills. And you do have to be able to master them individually. How we blend that with a a greater feeling of what really happens in these classes and how people learn and what things they do. We've got to do some more of that in order to get them intrigued. We can't do, what I would do if I could, I'd do the kind of engineering first tradition, right? You come in, your first engineering course just solves problems. The problem for us is that it's hard to know who the engineering majors are early on. So we've got to find other ways to engage them and think about them. But it's important.
Do you tax the revenue that comes in from the athletic programs at the same rate that you tax revenue, for example, from NSF grants?
Well, we don't tax revenue from NSF grants in the sense that there's overhead, but every research dollar that comes in, we lose money on by the time you measure it. We run athletics as an independent, and in particular NCAA varsity athletics, as an independent, revenue-neutral mechanism. On the other hand, they provide their own financial aid. And because of the way NCAA athletics works, every dollar of financial aid that you give to a student athlete counts as a athletic financial aid, not as our core financial aid program. So they provide all the financial aid for our student athletes. So that is a contribution. They're paying the ticket for lots of students in that.
I'm left scratching my head a little bit as to why it's so important that like a majority of people teaching at the primary and secondary level need to have a degree, whether it's a doctorate or even a minor in that area.
Well, not a doctorate. I mean, some degree, a minor, bachelor's degree.
It seems like people like myself and others in this room who are in a similar position here, if we're going to go and have 3 to 5 careers, why can't we take this spark for lifelong learning we get at a great research university and 25 years down the road decide we're really interested in ancient history and go on and teach it well at a high school level and not be judged for the fact that we're some engineer from the early 2000s.
Well, that's fine if you come back and learn something about it before you go teach it. That would be great. I think the problem, there's a particular problem around science and math, and if you talk to elementary school teachers, you'd find that many of them are simply one chapter ahead of the class, and they're trying to master and understand the material, and they don't understand some of the core things. My greatest experiment that I do is I sit down and I ask a teacher, okay, explain to me why long division and long multiplication work. And they know how to repeat what happens in long multiplication and long division, but they don't necessarily understand why it works. But it's place value. And this is one of the most important things we teach young people, is place value. And they really can't understand it in the context of place value, which is really there's no other purpose to learn long division and long multiplication except to learn the concept of place value, which is a really important concept, because everything about how you estimate, how you do approximation relates to understanding that. I remember I learned this, I was in new math and they tried to teach us binary numbers as a way of teaching place value. I think the teachers were just totally confused by that because they didn't really understand it in a fundamental way. And it is that fundamental insight that you're really trying to convey. The same thing in science. You're not trying to explain everything. Just take simple things like explaining why the seasons exist, why the tides exist. And I guarantee you, people that don't have some real science understanding will have a hard time explaining why we have seasons and why we have tides. And that, I think, is a mistake. We should have that explanation in there. How else are you going to excite people about science and math? And you do need to excite them about it. You need to excite young people about it.
I'm wondering if you could comment on your thoughts on the structure of the research university, and particularly there's been interesting conversation about the success of tenure and also the balance of tenured faculty with those who are just teaching or those who are research scientists, and if you see that there might be useful changes in the structure of the university which would actually help our research universities be more successful in the future.
Yeah, so, I mean, I guess if I could figure out how to do it, I'd blow up tenure, but it's a very hard thing to figure out how to do because you don't want to be the first institution to eliminate tenure. That will be very difficult. But I think, you could try experiments like offering people long-term contracts rather than tenure as an opportunity. Tenure I think tenure for protection of academic freedom is an old idea. It's not the issue anymore. Academic freedom is so well protected by other mechanisms in the academy that you don't need to worry about that. Tenure is a form of job security in some sense. Long-term contracts could play that role as well. At great research universities, where you set the tenure bar fairly high, this is not a fundamental issue because most people work very hard to get over that tenure bar, and they are driven by recognition of their peers and by their own accomplishments. So they continue to produce over a lifetime. But it is a problem at other institutions. You've also got to worry about, who does the teaching and how you think about teaching. The good news is, when I was a young assistant professor, there were still people who couldn't teach who got tenure. That doesn't happen anymore. That's the good news, I think, in our universities. We've really addressed that issue. But obviously, there's a combination of faculty, teaching faculty, tenure faculty, that are going to have to be needed in order to make the system vibrant and make it work. And I think getting that balance right and figuring out how you evolve that system and you create attractive opportunities for people who would like to go into higher education, I think will be key going forward. My doubt is that tenure's not going to easily go away. Of course, it should really go away at K-12, where it really, I think, serves no useful purpose. But we could do some refinement. One other closing remark on this. The really hard thing isn't to predict and measure the trajectory of people in the sciences and engineering. There are lots of ways to measure people's productivity, people's accomplishments. There's an award system. But in the humanities, what's really amazing is people peak in their 50s and 60s. You go look at when a humanist does their very best work, their crowning achievement. It's often not until they're in their 50s or 60s. One of my former provosts used to say, engineers, your salaries should go flat after a while because you're no longer as smart as the people who are younger than you. But historians keep learning more over their entire lives, so their salaries should go up steadily over time. And it's an interesting reflection on the difference between disciplines. All right, thank you all.